Now that we had a look at so many different hooks, let's take a step back, or actually stay in the hooks world, but see how we can optimize our project, how we can avoid unnecessary re-render cycles, because that's of course something we might also be interested in doing to ensure that we have an app that performs well. And for that, let's have a look at the ingredients.js file. There we're managing a bunch of logic. We have two reducers in there. We're changing the loading state, for example, and we update the UI in this case. And one thing I can already see there is that, for example, I'm passing the add ingredient handler to the ingredient form, and add ingredient handler in the end is just this function. This means that since it's a function defined inside of this functional component, whenever this functional component rebuilds and therefore this whole function gets executed again, this function will be recreated. Now, a side note here, by the way, use reducer and so on will not be recreated. Of course, this is called again, but React detects that this reducer is already initialized for this component and uses that already initialized value. So that's no problem. But here for add ingredient handler and so on, we're creating a brand new function. This brand new function is therefore passed down to the ingredient form. And hence in the ingredient form, even though I'm using React memo, this will rebuild. And I can prove this to you. Can throw in a console log rendering ingredient form, and theoretically that should only be rendered whenever we type in there, because these are the only things that change the form, and of course when we initially load it. But what you will see is that, for example, if I add something, test 5, let's clear the log, I hit add ingredient, you see it's re-rendered a bunch, and that makes sense because it's re-rendered when we change the loading state. Well, actually that makes sense because we're outputting the loading indicator here, but it's also re-rendered once the data is there and we're outputting the data down there. And this is not what we want. There is no reason to render this form if we're just outputting some data down there. So that should be one render cycle too much we have here. 2 makes sense because we switch loading from false to true and then back from true to false once we're done. So we definitely will render twice because the loading spinner is in the form, but the third output here makes no sense. We can get rid of that by wrapping add ingredient handler with use callback, which we already saw before. And for that, you need to import use callback from React, of course. And then you wrap your entire handler function with that. And then you add square brackets where you define the dependencies of this function. The dependency here is dispatch HTTP, which you don't need to specify because just like the updating function from use state, this is guaranteed by React to not change between render cycles. So you could add it, but you don't have to. Ingredient is a local argument we're getting in the function, not an external one, so nothing we need to do there. And therefore, overall, there's nothing in here on which this would depend. So this function actually should never be rebuilt. It's always the same function. It has no external dependencies other than dispatch HTTP, which, as I said, is managed by React such that it won't change. So it's not really a dependency. If we do that, then if we log in here and I add another ingredient here, we only see 2 render cycles. The third one is gone because this function, add ingredient handler, is now not rebuilt. We're passing this function into ingredient form, but since it doesn't change between render cycles, React memo detects that the new function we're getting when the parent component rebuilds is the old function and therefore doesn't rebuild this component. That's how it works. Loading, when it changes, of course, breaks through that, as it should, and triggers a rebuild on the ingredient form if it changes. If loading would not change, if we had false before and false for the next render cycle as well, this would not be rebuilt. So now we're taking advantage of React memo here. The same for the ingredient list. When we change the ingredients, this should rebuild, but it will now also rebuild all the time because we pass in the remove ingredient handler, and that's also not wrapped by use callback. The result of that is that the ingredient list will also rebuild too often. If we add a console log statement in there, rendering ingredient list, something like this, then you'll see, of course, it loads initially a couple of times because of the loading state change. It loads initially and then loads once the data is there. But you will also see that it also loads in cases where it shouldn't. For example, if I click on test here, it renders way too often. Of course it should render once the data is gone, but it should not render just because we're showing a loading spinner up there, and that is the first thing we're doing. So, same logic as before. The dependencies of ingredient list are on remove item. Please note I'm not using React Memo here, so the following change will not alone have a result. But still it's a first step. Remove ingredient handler, we use callback here, and wrap this entire function with it, and then specify the dependencies. Dependencies are dispatch HTTP, which as mentioned doesn't have to be specified. Ingredient ID is an internal value, not an external one. Nothing else in there which matters, so it's an empty array. Now again, as mentioned, this alone won't make a difference. If I delete test here, we still see a bunch of ingredient list re-renderings. Now it makes sense because in ingredient list, I'm not using React Memo. So of course we can do this. We can use React Memo here, wrap this entire component with it, like this. And if we do so, we log in, clear this, and I click bananas, we only render it once. So we're having the effect we want. We're only rendering this when this changes, not when something totally different changes. And there's nothing wrong with doing this, and actually this is the approach you'll typically use. Still, I want to show you an alternative, because there also is another hook you can use, and that's the usememo hook. UseCallback was a hook to save a function that doesn't change, so that no new function is generated. Usememo is a hook where you can save a value which is saved, so that the value isn't recreated. And that is another way of memorizing a component. So here, that would be our ingredient list. Let me cut it from there and add it here. Ingredient list maybe like this. And now use usememo here. Pass a function to it. This is not a function that's now memorized though. Instead, it's a function that React will execute for you. And that function should return the value which you want to memorize. Ingredient list here. Now usememo also needs a second argument, which is a list of dependencies you have. This tells React when it should rerun this function to create a new object that it should memorize. And we know it should rerun this function whenever the user ingredients change. So let's add this here. Or whenever remove ingredient handler changes. And that shouldn't change because we wrapped that with useCallback. So only changes to user ingredients should really rerun this function and rebuild a new ingredient list. And now ingredient list is of course something we can output down there. Ingredient list like this. If we save this and we log in, ingredients are getting rendered. Now let's add bananas here. 10. Add this. We updated the ingredient list once. If I delete them, we updated it once. It's an alternative to React Memo. Now, if we're talking about storing components, you typically want to use React Memo instead of usememo. But keep in mind that with usememo, you can store any data which you don't want to recreate on every re-render cycle of this component. So if you have some operation that calculates a more complex value, calculates a value which maybe takes a bit longer to calculate, then you want to consider wrapping it with usememo so that it's not recalculated whenever the component re-renders, but really only recalculated when you need to recalculate it. That's the idea here. Now, last optimization I want to apply is here on the error modal. On close, we call clear error. It's this function. And there again, we can use callback to make sure that the error modal isn't re-rendered unnecessarily. We have no external dependencies here, so it's as simple as that. And now we also make sure that the error modal, which already uses React Memo, isn't re-rendered in cases where it shouldn't. So these are some optimizations you can apply and you should think about. Now, it's not the end of the world if you forget one, because re-rendering sounds like a super intensive work. If it's a small component, an easy update, it might be super fast to re-render. And re-render always means re-rendered in the virtual DOM, right? You learned that earlier in the course. Does not mean that whatever changed is automatically written to the real DOM. But even that virtual DOM re-rendering can be avoided with useCallback, usememo, and React Memo. But if you have very trivial components, it might even be worth not adding React Memo, so you shouldn't wrap every component with React Memo or with usememo, because React then always needs to check whether props changed, and if it's a super small component, re-rendering it might just be faster than performing that check. So it's always something you have to evaluate and think about. For example, for the error modal, we could probably get away with always re-rendering that and not using React Memo. So these are examples, and these are things you just have to play around with, test, and also check how fast your application is to get a feeling for this, where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense.